A clay tablet in the British Museum contains the only words written by someone who witnessed the death of Alexander the Great. Just 6 words. The king died. Clouds. No explanation. No cause. No final speech. Just weather and the death of the most powerful man on earth. In 323 BC, Alexander ruled an empire stretching from Greece to India. He was only 32 years old. He was planning new campaigns, new conquests, a future that seemed limitless. Then, in Babylon, he developed a fever. At first, nobody panicked. Kings got sick. Kings recovered. But each day, Alexander grew weaker. Soon he could no longer walk. Then he could no longer speak. And as the strongest man in the known world began to disappear, a terrifying question spread through the palace. Who rules now? Because Alexander had built an empire around one man, and nobody had prepared for what would happen if that man died. This is the story of the 11 days that changed the ancient world forever. Babylon was not supposed to be the end. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander stood at the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. His armies had marched more than 20,000 miles. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and rivers that many Greeks had never even heard of. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the edge of India, nearly every major power he encountered had fallen before him. And yet Alexander wasn't finished. New ships were being built. New troops were being assembled. A massive campaign against Arabia was already being planned. At just 32 years old, the conqueror of Persia was preparing for what he believed would be the next chapter of his empire. Then he got sick. The surviving sources disagree on many details, but they agree on one thing: the fever did not go away. At first, nobody seems to have panicked. That wasn't unusual. Kings became ill. Generals became ill. Even Alexander had suffered wounds and sickness before. The expectation was simple: he would recover. The next day, despite the fever, Alexander continued carrying out royal business. Orders were issued. Sacrifices were performed. Plans for Arabia moved forward. The machinery of empire kept turning. And so did Alexander, at least from the outside. But something had changed. The fever remained, and each day it became harder to ignore. The surviving sources disagree on many details, but they agree on one thing: the fever did not go away. At first, nobody seems to have panicked. That wasn't unusual. Kings became ill. Generals became ill. Even Alexander had suffered wounds and sickness before. The expectation was simple: he would recover. The next day, despite the fever, Alexander continued carrying out royal business. Orders were issued. Sacrifices were performed. Plans for Arabia moved forward. The machinery of empire kept turning. And so did Alexander, at least from the outside. But something had changed. The fever remained, and each day it became harder to ignore. By day 2, he could no longer walk. Instead of moving, he was carried. Yet even then, the orders continued. Maps were unrolled beside his bed. Officers came and went. Messengers waited for instructions. The greatest empire on earth still depended on one man's decisions, and that man was now making them while burning with fever. The court began to notice, not because Alexander admitted weakness, he rarely did, but because the pattern repeated itself. Every morning the same hope, every evening the same disappointment. The fever remained. Days passed. The planned Arabian expedition was still on the schedule. Ships were still being prepared. Commanders were still receiving assignments. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, everyone could see that something was wrong. Then the language of the sources begins to shift. Until now, the illness had sounded manageable. Suddenly, it sounded serious. One account describes Alexander's condition with a single word: grave. Not wounded, not exhausted, not recovering. Grave. For the first time, the possibility that the king might not recover entered the story. No one said it openly, not yet. But it was there, lingering in every conversation, every glance between officers, every delayed answer from the physicians. The empire had been built around a single man, and for the first time since Alexander crossed into Asia more than a decade earlier, that man looked vulnerable. The fever had now lasted for days. It showed no sign of breaking. And in Babylon, a question was beginning to form that nobody had ever seriously needed to ask before. What happens if Alexander doesn't get better? By day 6, recovery no longer seemed likely. The fever had outlasted every expectation. Alexander was moved to the royal park near Babylon, where cooler air and water might bring relief. Nothing changed. The fever remained. Yet even now, the routine continued. Sacrifices were performed. Officers arrived with reports. Plans for Arabia were still discussed. The machinery of empire had not stopped, but it was beginning to strain. Every order now passed through a man who was visibly weaker than the day before. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. Alexander was planning future conquests, and at the same time, struggling to sit upright. By day 7, the sources describe him as very weak, not dying, not defeated, simply diminished. A word that would have sounded impossible only weeks earlier. For more than a decade, Alexander had seemed almost untouchable. He survived wounds that should have killed him, crossed deserts that destroyed entire armies, defeated kings with greater resources and larger forces. Now his greatest enemy was something he could not charge, outmaneuver, or fight. A fever. Still, the Arabian campaign remained on the schedule. Ships were waiting. Commanders were preparing. Somewhere beyond Babylon, soldiers expected new orders. But inside the palace, a different reality was taking shape. Then came day 8, the moment everything changed. Until now, Alexander had remained at the center of the empire's decision-making, weak, sick, carried from place to place, but still in command. Then he lost his voice. The surviving accounts describe a king who could still recognize the men around him, still understand what was happening, still follow conversations, but no longer speak. The distinction mattered, because a silent king was not the same thing as a dead king. And yet, for an empire built entirely around one man's authority, silence created a problem almost as dangerous. Orders could no longer be clarified. Questions could no longer be answered. Disputes could no longer be settled. The empire suddenly found itself waiting for instructions that might never come. Outside Alexander's chamber, the atmosphere began to change. Generals gathered. Officers whispered. No one knew how long the silence would last. More importantly, no one knew what came next. Alexander had conquered an empire, but he had never clearly prepared a successor. There was no established heir ready to take command, no orderly transfer of power, no written plan for a future without him. And now the men closest to him were beginning to look at one another differently, not as companions, not as fellow veterans, but as rivals. Then, on the following day, the companions turned somewhere else for answers. They went to the temple of Serapis. The question they carried was simple. Should Alexander be moved? Would bringing him before the god improve his chances of survival? The response they received was unexpected. Leave him where he is. Whether the answer came from priests, ritual interpretation, or genuine belief hardly mattered. What mattered was what it revealed. The greatest generals in the known world had run out of solutions. The conquerors of Persia, the commanders who had marched from Greece to India, the men who controlled the largest empire on earth, were now asking a god what to do next. And in Babylon, the question that began as a whisper was becoming impossible to ignore. If Alexander could no longer speak, who was ruling the empire? By day 9, uncertainty had become its own kind of crisis. Inside the palace, Alexander was still alive. Outside, many were no longer sure. Rumors spread through Babylon. Some claimed the king was already dead. Others insisted he was recovering. Most simply admitted they did not know. Information moved slowly in the ancient world. And when information disappeared, rumor filled the space. The palace gates became a gathering point. Soldiers waited. Officers demanded answers. Messengers came and went. Yet no clear statement emerged. The silence surrounding the king was becoming almost as alarming as the illness itself. Because if Alexander had died, everything changed. And if he had not died, the question remained. Why wasn't anyone allowed to see him? The uncertainty grew. Then the pressure became impossible to contain. The Macedonian army demanded proof. Not reports. Not reassurances. Proof. These were not distant subjects. Many of these men had followed Alexander for more than a decade. They had crossed Asia together, fought together, bled together. They had watched him lead charges from the front when other kings remained safely behind the lines. Now they wanted to see him with their own eyes. The doors were opened. What followed became one of the most haunting scenes in ancient history. One by one, the soldiers entered. Veterans, companions, Men who had marched from Greece to India. Each passed the king's bed. Each looked upon the man who had carried them to the edge of the known world. Alexander could no longer speak, but he was still conscious, still watching, still recognizing the faces that passed before him. And as each soldier walked by, Alexander acknowledged them, perhaps with a movement of the eyes, perhaps with a slight gesture. Whatever strength remained, it was enough. Then came day 11. The waiting ended. After nearly 2 weeks of fever, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. The man who had conquered the Persian Empire, the man who had never lost a battle, the man who planned to push farther still, was gone. And almost immediately, another mystery appeared. Several later sources claimed that Alexander's body showed no obvious signs of decomposition for days. Whether this reflected the climate, the conditions of preservation, or later legend remains debated, but the story endured. Even in death, Alexander seemed to resist becoming ordinary. Yet the empire had no time for legends, because the moment the king died, the question everyone feared returned with greater force than ever. Who ruled now? The morning after Alexander died, the empire still existed. Its armies were intact. Its cities still paid taxes. Its governors still held office. From a distance, nothing seemed to have changed, but the man holding it all together was gone. And almost immediately, the question that had haunted the final days of his illness demanded an answer. Who ruled now? The problem was that there was no obvious successor. Alexander left no adult son, no universally accepted heir, no written instructions capable of settling the matter. Instead, the generals faced an uncomfortable reality. The largest empire on earth had no clear king. Eventually, a compromise emerged. One candidate was Philip Rhadaeus, Alexander's half-brother. He carried royal blood, but he lacked the authority, ability, and reputation needed to command an empire of this scale. The second candidate had not even been born. Alexander's wife, Roxana, was pregnant. If her child proved to be a son, he would inherit his father's name, and perhaps, one day, his father's throne. So the empire did something extraordinary. It chose both. Philip Rhadaeus would become King Philip III, and the unborn child, if male, would become Alexander IV. On paper, the succession crisis was solved. In reality, it had only begun. Because neither king possessed real power, one could not effectively rule. The other had not yet entered the world. The throne was occupied, but authority was not. And in that empty space, the generals moved. At first, they spoke of unity, of preserving Alexander's legacy, of protecting the empire he had built. But ambition has a way of revealing itself when restraints disappear. The men who once marched together now began calculating futures that no longer included one another. Perdiccas became regent. Ptolemy looked toward Egypt. Antigonus strengthened his position in Asia. Others did the same. Each claimed to be protecting the empire. Each was preparing for the possibility of ruling part of it. Within only a few years, the struggle became open. Alliances formed. Alliances collapsed. Armies marched. Battles followed. The empire Alexander created did not survive him as a united state. It fragmented into competing kingdoms ruled by competing successors. The age of conquest gave way to the age of succession, and the wars that followed would continue for decades. The tragedy was not that Alexander died. Every king dies. The tragedy was that nobody had prepared for what came next. An empire built around one extraordinary individual had inherited his greatest weakness. It depended on him. Remove Alexander, and the structure beneath him began to crack. Then it broke. Centuries passed. Empires rose. Empires fell. The tomb vanished. Its location was lost. And so the story ends where it began. A king dies. An empire breaks. A tomb disappears. The fever ended Alexander's life. What followed ended Alexander's empire.